welcome. I'm Ijoma Honyato. Tonight, Code of Conduct Tribunal delivers landmark judgment, acquits Senate President of charges of false declaration of assets and corruption. Jubilation among supporters as Senate President Bukola Saraki declares faith in judiciary. Federal government convenes meeting of Southeast leaders, tells them to ignore threats issued by Arawa youth. And death toll in London fire rises to 12 scores in hospital, with 20 in critical condition.
On business news tonight, credit valuation ratings agency Fitch Ratings assigns Nigeria's diaspora bond a highly speculative assessment with negative outlook.
While on sports news, newly elected presidents of the sports federations in Nigeria get down to work, push for grassroots development.
The Inspector General of Police deploys 500 policemen to patrol Abuja-Kaduna Highway to stem the tide of kidnapping.
We begin tonight with the landmark judgment of the Code of Conduct Tribunal sitting in Abuja. The tribunal chairman, Justice Danladi Umar, in his ruling on the Senate President's case, declared that Dr. Bukola Saraki has no case to answer and went on to acquit him of charges of corruption and false declaration of assets. Our correspondent Yemi Sikbai reports.
The Senate President, Dr. Bukola Saraki, arrives at the Code of Conduct Tribunal with distinguished senators in support. It's been nearly 2 years since his trial on false declaration of assets commenced way back in September 2015. Then on a 13-count charge, increased to a 16-count charge in April 2016, and finally an 18-count charge in February 2017. The Honourable Chairman of the two-man panel, Mr. Danladi Umar, commences his highly anticipated ruling to the defence's no-case submission filed on the 26th of May by stating that the prosecution had not made out a case against the defendant. He continues that the investigation on the defendant had been an intelligence-gathering exercise and that the 4 prosecution witnesses were manifestly unreliable. He concludes that no reasonable tribunal could safely convict on the evidence produced, that the prosecution did not prove the essential elements of the offence, and that the tribunal had to discharge the defendant. The second panel member, Honourable William Ateze, agrees and states that the formulation of the 18-count charge was predicated on the testimony of the third prosecution witness, Mr. Samuel Madujemu of the CCB, who testified that details of the outcome of the investigation were based on information given to him by the team, that is, the EFCC, DSS and CCB. However, the term team had no constitutional or statutory backing. He highlights that this was a fatal flaw of the prosecution, as his evidence rendered all evidence of the prosecution invalid. Indeed, it was an affliction that bedeviled the prosecution's case. Mr. Ateze ruled that the other fatal flaws included hearsay evidence by prosecution witnesses, the failure to take a statement from the defendant, and the failure to link the defendant with the commission of the offence and the counts as charged. He further ruled that the prosecution failed to call crucial witnesses that would link the defendant to the offence, and concluded that the defendant has no case whatsoever to answer and is discharged and acquitted. Counsel for both sides thanked the tribunal, but the lead prosecution lawyer, Rotimi Jacobs, SAN, had been noticeably absent. The Senate President left the court amidst jubilant supporters, and his defence counsel comment.
You recall that I had always, in addressing you, told you that the prosecution had no case, that the case had collapsed, and that every time we destroyed the case, they amended to try to patch it up. I had always told you this, and it gives me no particular pleasure to say I told you so, but that's how it is. I told you so.
But prosecuting counsel had this reaction.
We have already started making arrangements to get a copy of the ruling. As soon as it's out, then we'll study it and then we know what next to do.
So, the dramatic acquittal of Dr. Bukola Saraki by the CCT ends the controversial trial of the Senate President. But is this case really over? Or will there be an appeal? Yemisi Paya, Channels Television News.
In the meantime, the Senate President, Dr. Bukola Saraki, has been reacting to the judgment. In a 7-paragraph statement, he affirmed that the judgment is one that every Nigerian should celebrate. He also says he bears no grudges against all those behind what he calls his persecution. In his words, with the outcome of this case, our faith is renewed in our courts and our hope is restored that the judiciary in our country could indeed provide sanctuary for all those who seek justice. End of quote. He also thanks God and his colleagues at the National Assembly for their abiding support all through his trial, saying, "They demonstrated their strong conviction about the choice we all decided to make 2 years ago. I thank members of my family for their unflinching support. I thank all friends and supporters back home in Kwara State and across the length and breadth of the country for their prayers and their sacrifices. My gratitude goes to all members of my legal team for their tireless efforts to ensure the cause of justice is served." End of quote. And more reactions continue to trail today's verdict. The governor of Kwara and Ekiti states believe the judgment will allow the number 3 man carry out his legislative duties appropriately.
The jubilatory mood took off from the courtroom. And in the Senate President's home state of Kwara, supporters and members of the All Progressives Congress APC dance and celebrate what they say was a political trial. And for the governor, Abdul Fattah Ahmed, he believes the CCT trial was a distraction to the Senate President from performing his duties.
Obviously, we know from the way the case went through, was a distraction. But we're happy that justice has been allowed to take its course after all.
In neighboring state of Ekiti, the chairman of the PDP Governors Forum and governor of Ekiti State, Ayodele Fayose, who has always been critical of the federal government, says the trial was simply a vendetta.
Well, if you recall that my prediction for 2016, even before Bukola Saraki was charged, I said Bukola Saraki will be tried and it will end up in nothing, to be like an exercise in futility, because this government is known for vendetta. They have nothing to offer. If you see the trend, they lose all the cases. At the end of the day, they come back and blame judiciary, because what you start with vendetta will end up in the midst of nowhere.
Each time the Senate President appeared at the tribunal, his deputy, Ike Ekweremadu, stands in to preside. Senator Ekweremadu's views on the trial is similar to that of the governor of Ekiti State. He said, and I quote, "This is another sweet victory for the 8th Senate, in particular, separation of powers, the rule of law, and the nation's democracy." Senator Saraki's case at the Code of Conduct Tribunal is not the first high-profile case to be thrown out, but the Senate President has said the outcome of the case has renewed his faith in Nigerian courts. Seun Wakimaloye, Channels Television News.
Away from today's landmark verdict, the Senate has asked the President to submit resolutions of the National Conference to the National Assembly for deliberation. The Senate made the request after lawmakers considered a motion on the need for national unity and peaceful coexistence in the country. Our correspondent Linda Akigbe reports.
Igbo have a saying that the reason that you have elders is so that children don't go and eat beetle and call it weevil.
God bless you.
Because it is only the elder that will tell the child, this one is not edible, it's a beetle. This one is a weevil, because they all look alike.
A proverb which could be interpreted in many ways, but perhaps a call for elders to calm the tensions brewing in the country. In the face of calls for secession and mounting ethnic and religious intolerance which have enveloped national consciousness, 106 senators have thrown their weight behind a motion on the need for national unity and peaceful coexistence in Nigeria.
The Senate is concerned also that recently they have been clamoring for ethnically based and regionally supported threat to one united Nigeria in various parts of the country.
There are few countries survive a second civil war.
But some lawmakers argue that while they support the motion, government at all levels must not lose sight of the reason for the agitations.
The problem today in Nigeria, Mr. President, is that if you have a problem and you are talking quietly and peacefully, nobody listens to you unless you begin to blow up things and make trouble. That is why you see every section of this country, people are trying to show their capacity to self-destruct. We must, as a country, begin to listen to people when they are not creating problems. That is part of what we are not doing.
A young generation of people who have never seen bloodshed, war, destruction, people being killed, amputated, families being divided, sure they can think like that. But what have we done as a nation to educate them about the destruction of war? Absolutely nothing. We do not teach this in our history books. We do not tell our children what war is all about. It's easy to talk about war. How many people have carried a gun, an AK-47?
At the end of a passionate debate by lawmakers, they resolved that the president should submit the resolutions of a national conference to the National Assembly for deliberation. In the twilight of the last administration, former President Goodluck Jonathan sent the report of a national conference to the 7th Assembly. However, both chambers did not work on the report before the expiration of the 7th Assembly. Linda Akibi, Channels Television News.
Loyalty to the nation shall override sectional loyalties. Well, that's coming from the acting president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, when he spoke during a meeting with the Southeast leaders today at the presidential villa. Professor Osinbajo asked the leaders of the region to speak out against hate and divisive threats. Our correspondent Gloria Umezuke reports.
This is the second day of meetings by the acting president on the singular issue of threats by two ethnic groups, which has gained momentum in recent weeks. Please be seated. Professor Osinbajo told a cross-section of leaders of thoughts from across the Southeast that loyalty to the nation should always take precedence over any belief or group, urging them to speak out against divisive speeches.
Burying our heads in the sand and expecting the storm to blow over of their own accord is not an option. But equally not reasonable is falling for the temptation for any kind of tit for tat, whether it is in language used or is in the kinds of gestures that have been expressed. This has never worked or moved anyone closer to a peaceful or sensible resolution. It's also clear that war sometimes starts not with bullets, but with words. Hateful, incendiary speech opening floodgates of blood. The tongue, like the pen, is often mightier than the sword, because that is what pushes us. Knowing this, under no conditions whatsoever should we tolerate or excuse or justify hate speech or hateful conduct of any kind, especially where such is illegal. Let there be no doubt whatsoever of the resolve of government to ensure that no one will be allowed to get away with making speeches that can cause division, especially violence. We'll take very seriously any attempts to cause violence or to disrupt the peace of Nigeria.
Restating his earlier warning, the acting president says the federal government would not hide beneath any ethnic or religious platform to lend support to any group.
I'm sure so many of us have heard it, that without peace and security there can be no development. And the first obligation that we owe if we want to develop is to ensure peace and security. It is also the aspiration of the Constitution to ensure a country in which, and I quote, loyalty to the nation shall override sectional loyalties. And it's the responsibility of the government to create the conditions for the attainment of these ideals.
3 hours after the closed-door meeting, the governor of Ebonyi State told State House correspondents that the new resolve is for all to engage in peaceful dialogue.
We emphasize that there is a need for everybody to, restrain from making hate statements. We should be making statements that should be binding us together. Statements of love, statements of unity, statements of hope. And of course, we should also work very hard.
The consultative meeting will be rounded up with every invited group in attendance and, in the end, chart a positive way forward for all Nigerians. Gloria Umezuke, Channels Television News.
In part 2, after the break, the Inspector General of Police sends 500 policemen to Abuja-Kaduna Highway to rout kidnappers. That's in a moment. Do join us again.